Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a strange little journey, where medieval beauty standards were not only unfamiliar but, honestly, a bit scary. But before we dive in, take a second to do one small thing. If you find these stories I tell even a little entertaining or they make you chuckle, hit that like button. But only if you truly think it's worth it. And if you're curious to hear even more oddities from history, from love stories to some truly questionable food, then make sure to subscribe so you won't miss a single episode. Oh, and there's one thing I really want to know. Where in the world are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are right now? I love reading the comments and finding out that some people are lying in bed about to sleep, others are listening while working, and a few are sitting in a little cafe in the middle of the afternoon. Those little snapshots make this community feel alive, like a conversation stretching across space and time. So, before we sink into the secrets of the past, where pale skin could be seen as a symbol of power, leave a comment. Trust me, nothing's better than seeing people from dozens of countries and time zones all gathering here just to hear a bit of history. These days, a tan usually brings to mind beach vacations, gym sessions, or at the very least someone just coming back from a fancy trip. But in the Middle Ages, it was the complete opposite. Tanned skin, bad. It wasn't a sign of health, but a dead giveaway that you belonged to the class that worked the fields under the sun. In other words, peasants. And nothing killed your beauty score faster back then than people looking at you and thinking, she must have just finished milking the cows. Instead, the ideal of beauty was ghostly pale skin. The whiter the better, sometimes so white you looked like you just crawled out of the grave. A pale, sickly face wasn't a health red flag, it was a status symbol. It whispered, I'm rich enough to never lift a finger, never see the Sunday. The problem was, not everyone was born with porcelain skin. Labourers had no chance, but even nobles couldn't avoid the sun forever. So, a whole arsenal of beauty hacks was invented. Picture lords and ladies in castles patiently smearing their faces with mixtures that, today, would have any dermatologist screaming. White lead powder was weapon number one. They'd mix vinegar with metal, let it corrode into a white crust, grind it into fine powder. Voila! The high-end face powder of the 14th century. The catch? It was full of toxic lead, and putting it on every day was basically signing up for a slow death. But for the aristocracy, the trade-off was worth it, because they believed better to die in style than be mistaken for a peasant. And that wasn't all. Some recipes were even stranger. People soaked cloth in vinegar and laid it on their face to bleach the skin. Others crushed pearls and mixed them with egg whites, smearing it on their face for a glossy look. Sounds luxurious, but imagine sitting all day with your face stiff as an omelette. Not exactly seductive. And because pale alone wasn't enough, blue veins were sometimes painted on with blue dye. The idea was, skin so thin you could see the veins underneath. A mark of refinement and fragility. A lady with porcelain skin and painted veins looked like she was about to shatter into pieces. Yet that was the height of elegance. Poetry and literature fueled this obsession too. Romantic poets compared beautiful women to being white as milk, white as snow, or white as winter moonlight. Sweet words, but in reality, it was just a fancy way of saying, she looks like she's about to faint. Of course, the side effects of slathering on lead, mercury, or other bizarre mixtures were unavoidable. Peeling skin, ulcers, hair loss, even death. But remember, in a society where honor and class mattered more than health, beauty was sometimes worth more than life itself. And here's the twist. It wasn't just women chasing this trend. Men, especially nobles in court, started using powder to look paler too. A pale, sunless male face, untouched by labour, was the perfect ideal. Proof he was wealthy, educated, not some brawny worker hauling stones. Compared to today, that standard was basically like keeping up with beauty trends on social media. Just like TikTok filters making everyone look the same. In the Middle Ages, nobody wanted their skin to be natural. They wanted it edited, to look like the noble ideal. In truth, this ghostly white standard was a social statement. It wasn't just about looks, it was about power. If you're pale, you don't work, you're elite. If you're tanned, you work the fields, you're poor. So every time someone looked in the mirror and brushed on another layer of lead powder, They weren't just putting on makeup, they were declaring their social rank. And in that context, beauty became a weapon. A lady arriving at a festival with a face white as porcelain immediately drew attention, not just for her looks, but for the message of power. I belong to a different class. The irony, of course, was that those ghostly faces also carried signs of sickness and death. Pale lips, blotchy skin, dark circles. Yet society still praised it, still worshipped it, still chased it. It shows something deeply human. Beauty standards are always irrational, but still manage to drive everyone crazy. So, the next time you see a whitening cream ad promising transformation, just remember, this isn't new. People have been obsessed with it for hundreds of years. The only difference is, instead of spending thousands on Korean skincare, medieval people smeared straight-up toxic metals on their faces. If there's one symbol that captures all the madness of medieval beauty standards, it's white lead powder. Today, just hearing the word lead makes us think of old houses being sealed off because of lead paint, or bright red hazard warnings on chemical packaging. But rewind the clock to the 14th and 15th centuries. That poison was actually in fashion. Lords and ladies back then didn't just want pale skin. They wanted it so pale it looked like a melting wax figure at a masquerade. And to achieve that effect, they turned to a deadly cosmetic, white lead powder, also called ceruse. The recipe wasn't fancy. Just take a sheet of lead, soak it in vinegar for a few weeks, wait until the surface corroded into a white crust, scrape it off, dry it, and grind it into powder. And there you had it. A luxury face powder, guaranteed smooth, matte, full coverage. In other words, it was the medieval version of foundation, but with a free death insurance plan included. At first glance, its effectiveness was undeniable. Applied to the skin, it instantly made the face smooth, ghostly bright, hiding freckles, pimples, or any flaws. In a society where white equals power, lead powder was the ticket into the noble world. But soon, the price became clear. Peeling skin, ulcers and infections, hair loss, eyebrows gone, eyelashes falling out, dizziness, fatigue, kidney failure. And finally, a slow death, with no one knowing why. People used to say that if a woman looked especially pale and was praised as exquisitely refined, it almost certainly meant she was inching closer to death from lead poisoning. One of the tragic yet darkly funny parts was how the horrific side effects were seen as proof it worked. If your skin started peeling, people said, "Oh, that powder is strong, it's working." If your hair started falling out, they whispered, "She must be using the noble formula." It's like someone today using a face cream that makes their skin blister, but they keep applying it because it's clearly doing something. And don't think only women risk their lives for beauty. Gentlemen at court, especially in France and Italy, jumped on the trend too. A ghostly white face with no trace of sun proved you never laboured. For men, it was also a power statement, as if to say, "I'm not busy with shovels, I'm busy with poetry and politics." Lead powder rarely went alone. It often came with companions: lipstick made with mercury, fiery red but causing mouth ulcers, rouge made with cinnabar, highly toxic but giving a natural flush, egg white glaze, leaving the face shiny like porcelain. The result? A face both ghostly pale and stiff, like a porcelain mask slowly cracking over time. If today's beauty bloggers post, "Get ready with me," videos trying foundations, powders, Korean cushions, then in the Middle Ages, the imaginary video would be, "Today I'm trying a new formula. Lead mixed with vinegar. Super smooth, super matte, super lethal. Don't forget to like and pray for me." Compared to modern cosmetic scandals with hidden chemicals, ceruse was the queen of all scandals. What kept this trend alive so long was how art legitimized it. Paintings from the time often depicted women with porcelain white skin, flawless faces. Noble portraits unintentionally became living ads for cosmetics. When art praises a standard, society accepts it as the ideal. In reality, many deaths of noble women in this period can be traced to lead poisoning. But with primitive medicine, people just thought of it as a noble disease, an inevitable price for refinement. They had no idea that the very powder they adored was the silent killer, eating away at their bodies day by day. Looking back, lead powder is a clear example of how beauty standards can push people to sacrifice health, even life itself. Back then, It was lead and mercury. Today, it might be extreme plastic surgery, shady creams, or unsafe beauty fads. Standards change, but the cycle of wanting to be beautiful at any cost never really ends. After turning their faces into ghostly white canvases, many noble ladies, and even some gentlemen, went on to paint fake blue veins on their skin. Sounds like a Halloween costume trick. But in the 14th century, it was proof that you were truly delicate, aristocratic, and, ironically, still alive. In that era's mindset, beautiful skin wasn't just pale. It had to be so thin that the veins underneath were visible. A wan face, with a few faint blue lines at the temples or on the chest, was seen as a mark of refinement, nobility, even something almost sacred. It quietly told the world, "My skin is so thin, light passes through it. I'm fragile. I don't do heavy labor. I was born only to read poetry and pray." Of course, not everyone was blessed with naturally paper-thin skin, so medieval makeup came up with a clever trick, using blue pigment to fake veins. This pigment was often made from ground azurite or lapis lazuli, precious minerals. The wealthy could crush semi-precious stones to paint on their skin, while the less fortunate used copper sulfate powder or cheaper dyes, sometimes just as toxic as lead powder. Picture a young noblewoman sitting in her chamber, while a maid carefully dabbed blue paint onto her arm, drawing delicate fake veins. The result was that, at a banquet, her arm looked so fragile it seemed a mere touch could shatter it. That wasn't just considered beautiful. It was alluring. The funny part is, what we often try to hide today with concealer, visible blue veins under the skin, was once elevated into a symbol of high status. In other words, if a girl from the 21st century time-traveled back to medieval Europe with dark under-eye circles from a Netflix binge, she might have been hailed as a great beauty. But don't think painting veins was just a small makeup detail. It was tied to a whole social idea. A pale face plus blue veins proved you had nothing to do with manual labor, let alone field work. It was a public confirmation you belonged to the upper class, far removed from the roughness of common folk. Another way of saying, you were too refined to touch a shovel, and fake veins were your passport to nobility. In romantic poetry of the time, this image was glorified as an ideal. Poets praised maidens with skin white as snow, with veins like hidden streams under ice. Sounds beautiful, but look closely and you might shiver, as if staring at a carefully painted corpse. And it wasn't limited to the face. Many noble women painted veins on their chest and arms, areas revealed by wide necklines or long sleeves. In candle-lit banquets, those painted blue veins stood out, giving the impression of a fragile, otherworldly being who didn't belong to the world of labor. Compared to today, this could be seen as the medieval version of highlighter. People now dust shimmer on their cheekbones for a radiant glow, or contour to fake sharp cheekbones. The only difference is, instead of sparkle, medieval folks chose the effect of blood under skin. Yes, they created a primitive version of contour, just creepier. But remember, those blue pigments weren't always safe. Azurite and malachite, two common minerals, both contain copper, and copper, when in contact with skin, can cause irritation, rashes, even mild poisoning. Combined with the lead foundation underneath, a noble's face was basically a walking chemistry lab. Yet to them, this was the standard of beauty. Some records even show that noble women hired professional painters, often artisans, to paint veins for them before big events. A grand banquet, the reception of an envoy, or a religious festival were all occasions to flaunt fake veins. And this was no different than us today hiring makeup artists for weddings or galas, except their look made you resemble a ghostly aristocrat. Of course, not everyone had the time or money to paint veins daily. For the middle class or those wanting a shortcut, they might wear gowns with thin lace, so candlelight naturally revealed real veins. This was the medieval DIY beauty hack. If you couldn't afford lapis lazuli, use sheer fabric and lighting. And when you look at 15th century portraits, you'll notice many figures with porcelain white skin and faint blue lines on their temples or arms. That wasn't natural. Most of it was painted, both literally and figuratively. This shows that beauty standards are never fixed. What we see as flaws today, visible veins, dark circles, in another era were signs of elegance. And maybe that reversal is what makes fashion and beauty history so fascinating. It reveals the absurd, yet deeply human, ways we define beauty. The next step in the medieval journey to beauty was turning the forehead into a vast open square. The higher, smoother, and emptier the forehead, the more it was seen as a sign of intelligence, purity, and class. The ideal woman of the time wasn't supposed to have a naturally balanced face, but rather a soaring forehead stretching almost to the top of the head. This was considered a symbol of superior intellect and a soul close to God. Some writers praised women with foreheads like cathedral domes, implying their faces carried something sacred. Poetry and art reinforced this ideal, endlessly depicting maidens with bright, wide, polished foreheads, untouched by a single hair or natural trace. To achieve this effect, noble women endured a painful and foul-smelling process. Step 1 was plucking out the eyebrows. That's right. While today bold, sharp brows are the frame of the face, in the Middle Ages, eyebrows were just weeds to be removed. Using crude tweezers, whetstones, or small knives, they scraped everything off, leaving behind a smooth, barren forehead. In 15th century portraits, noble women appear with ghostly pale faces and bare, rimless eyes, giving them a look that was both surreal and a little unsettling. But simply plucking brows wasn't enough. The hairline had to be pushed back too. Women shaved, plucked, or applied homemade depilatory creams to extend their foreheads. A common recipe included quicklime, tree resin, even cat dung mixed with vinegar. They smeared it on the hairline, let it corrode the follicles, then yanked out patches of hair. The result? A receding hairline, creating an empty stage of forehead. The more patient you were with this painful routine, the more perfect your forehead became. Fashion joined in to support the style. Head coverings, veils, and hennins, the towering cone-shaped hats, were all designed to showcase the broad forehead. Paired with pale skin and painted veins, the face became a moving religious icon. Countless portraits from England, France, and Italy show women with foreheads so long it looked like they were wearing half another head. The interesting part is that not everyone had the time or tools to expand the forehead. Peasants couldn't spend hours plucking hair daily. So, hacks emerged. Drawing a fake hairline to make the forehead look taller, or using veils to cover the real hair and trick the eye. This was the medieval version of contour and highlight. Hide what didn't fit the standard, accentuate what did. When placed in the social context, the absurd suddenly makes sense. A high, clean forehead, free of hair and brows, symbolized distance from manual labor. Farmers in the fields couldn't waste time plucking hairs. Only nobles with leisure, free from work, could maintain such a bizarre standard. So the forehead wasn't just a facial feature, it was a class declaration. Picture a lavish banquet. Among dozens of noble ladies, the one with the highest, smoothest, most barren forehead drew the most eyes. People whispered, "Her forehead is like a cathedral dome, like moonlight shining, like a pure sheet of rye, paper." Behind such praise was an entire social system where beauty equaled power and assumed intellect. Compared to modern times, this standard is like plastic surgery trends for a V-line jaw, or shaving brows to redraw them on trend. The difference is, today we have anesthetics and dermatologists, while medieval women endured real pain, smearing toxic pastes on their scalps to achieve beauty. Religion also played a role. Paintings of angels, the Virgin Mary, and saints often showed smooth, broad foreheads with minimal detail. Religious art unintentionally became a fashion catalogue, reinforcing the idea that women in real life should resemble those sacred images. From there, plucking brows and shaving hairlines stopped being odd behaviours and became the norm for aspiring holiness. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Some satirical writings mocked these women as eyebrowless freaks, or said they looked like walking corpses. But the power of trends and social pressure was so strong that, even with ridicule, it lasted for centuries. Today, looking at those portraits, many of us feel creeped out. But in the medieval setting, that was peak beauty. A forehead without brows, without hair, ghostly pale, painted with a few veins. All combined to create a face poets called the window of the soul, while common folk bluntly called it the noble ghost. It didn't stop at plucking eyebrows and pushing back the hairline. They went after a new ideal, the angelic face. A face with as little hair, as few natural details as possible, seen as closer to sacred purity. In the imagination of that time, the perfect face wasn't one marked by earthly traces like eyebrows, sideburns, or even eyelashes. To put it bluntly, they wanted a face smooth like a stone statue, both detached from reality and resembling the saints in church paintings. The first step in this journey was plucking hair around the temples and brows. Noble women used crude metal tweezers, sometimes heated to grip better, and patiently pulled one by one. The burning sting lasted for hours, but in return they gained a cleaner forehead and face. Not just the brows, eyelashes were victims too. People believed big, round, empty eyes without the frame of thick lashes best showed innocence and purity. So many women pulled out their lashes completely. Imagine eyes wide and bare, rimmed in pale skin, like a porcelain doll. That was their ideal. To maintain the hairless look, recipes were passed around. One mix included quicklime, tree resin, and animal fat, smeared on brows or hair, left to dry, then ripped off. It worked like waxing today, except with a high risk of chemical burns. For the more patient, there were natural versions. Onion or garlic juice, or honey mixed with vinegar, applied over time to weaken the hair until it fell out. Some records even mention arsenic diluted into depilatory creams. Of course, that left women not just browless, but with burns, festering wounds, even poisoning. Yet, when beauty meant status, pain and risk were just the membership fee to join the noble class. Gothic and early Renaissance religious paintings prove it. Images of the Virgin Mary, angels and saints often show faces smooth and bare, almost without brows or lashes. This created a beauty ideal. To look holy, you had to erase those details. And so, women turned themselves into living versions of the paintings. Each morning, the beauty ritual could take hours. Plucking, shaving, smearing concoctions, covering with lead powder, painting veins. The whole process was basically preparing to cosplay as a church mural. A face with no brows, no lashes, with a high forehead and pale skin became a social signal. It told everyone, I belong to the class that doesn't labour. I have the money, time, and leisure to endure the pain of beauty. Peasants in the fields couldn't pluck brows after exhausting work. Only nobles could maintain such a harsh standard. It reflected class division. Beauty wasn't just aesthetics, but a weapon of power. A noble woman walking into a hall with a ghostly white face, high forehead, and lashless eyes was immediately recognized as from the higher world. Not everyone approved. Satirists mocked women who turned themselves into browless monsters or looked like decorated skulls. Stories tell of husbands complaining their wives looked like ghosts barefaced, but once painted up were praised as saints. Yet mockery wasn't enough to kill the trend. Just like today's extreme diets or risky plastic surgeries, criticism coexisted with social pressure and the hunger for validation. And women kept going. Seen from today, plucking brows and redrawing them with lead powder or charcoal isn't so far from modern habits. Shaping brows, tattooing them, or applying false lashes. The difference is that today's tools are safer, but the essence is the same. Erase the natural to fit a standard society defines. The funny part is, fashion always cycles back. Centuries later, thick, dark brows returned as the standard. What was once vulgar is now sexy. What was once noble perfection, high foreheads, no brows, no lashes, now gives people chills. That shift shows beauty is never fixed, always a reflection of each era's madness. If plucking hair, brows, and lashes was enough to create the angelic face, the next question was, what about the rest of the body hair? In medieval beauty standards, a beautiful body also had to be smooth, hairless, untouched by the earthly traces of arm hair, leg hair, or even stray facial hair outside what was kept. So alongside razors and tweezers, women and noblemen too turned to dangerous depilatory creams, homemade mixtures that were both bizarre and deadly. The most common recipe started with quicklime. They ground it, mixed it with water, sometimes adding ash, or salt, turning it into a paste smeared directly on the skin. The principle was simple. The lime corroded the hair, making it fall out. The side effects, though, were burns, blisters, even ulcers. Records say that after a few uses, some women lost not only hair but also patches of skin, leaving permanent scars. A more sophisticated formula used diluted arsenic mixed with oil or vinegar. This not only weakened hair follicles but also paled the skin, hitting two ideals at once, white and smooth. But arsenic is highly toxic, and applying it to skin was basically tempting fate. Dizziness, nausea, and exhaustion were common, but in that society, it was simply the price of beauty. Other recipes sounded natural, but were no less punishing. Animal fat mixed with resin, pepper, or even honey and ash. Spread on the skin, the sticky mixture dried, then peeled off with the hair. Sounds familiar? Yes. It was the primitive version of waxing. Except instead of a spa with soothing scents, medieval women endured the stench of burnt fat, onions, garlic, or even animal dung, since some recipes literally said, "Add cat feces for stronger effect." In love letters or anecdotes from the time, there were even compliments like, "Her skin is smooth as porcelain, free of a single hair, like an angel in the church." Such praise drove women to suffer through pain and danger. The irony was that many depilatory creams not only removed hair, but also left the skin red, blotchy, and rash-covered. Instead of stopping, women covered the damage with white lead powder, then reapplied the depilatory later. It became a vicious cycle. The body turned into a chemical battlefield. Religion and morality added fuel. The church sometimes emphasized that a hairy body was a sign of worldliness, while smoothness was linked to angels and purity. That made hair removal a strict beauty standard. A lady with hairless white arms was admired, as if her body was closer to the Praetoriate. Divine. Compare that to today, and the parallel is uncanny. People still chase hairless smooth skin through waxing lasers or depilatory creams. The only difference is the safety and technology. The obsession with sleek, polished skin is exactly the same as it was hundreds of years ago. There are even stories of depilatory creams being used as dares at parties. One tale says a group of French noblewomen in the 15th century competed to see who could endure quicklime paste the longest. The winner was praised as resilient and noble, though the real prize was just corroded scars on her skin. And men weren't left out. Knights and courtiers wanted smooth hands to look better in leather or embroidered gloves. Hair removal became another way to prove they were above rough, sweaty, dirt-covered peasants. In art, statues and frescoes often depicted nobles with smooth, luminous, flawless skin. Once again, art became the beauty catalogue, reinforcing the idea that the perfect body was hairless. And so, the dangerous concoctions kept being whispered, passed down, and used, despite the pain and peril. No one wanted to look entirely like a frozen corpse. A faint pink blush on the cheeks made the face look more alive, more delicate, even bashful. But in the Middle Ages, wearing blush was a double-edged sword, admired on one hand, but also condemned as vanity, even sin. Back then, naturally rosy cheeks were associated with humility and vitality. A maiden entering a festival with ghostly white skin and just a soft pink flush looked like a flower blooming in the snow. But if the blush was too strong, too obviously artificial, whispers began. "She's trying to seduce men." The problem was finding that balance of just enough. A lady had to walk the tightrope between religion and fashion. The church warned that too much makeup was the mark of the sinful, while society longed to see that delicate, blushing beauty. So discreet blush recipes spread quietly through castles and convents. The most common natural method was beetroot, berries, or rose petals crushed and dabbed onto the cheeks. The effect was fresh, but it only lasted a few hours. Many women had to slip away from banquets to reapply blush with a little cloth soaked in beet juice hidden up their sleeve. But of course, creativity didn't stop there. More luxurious recipes used crushed insects, especially cochineal bugs, for a longer-lasting, vivid red. Sounds glamorous. But imagine smearing insect remains over a face already caked in toxic lead powder. It was more chemistry experiment than beauty ritual. The boldest went further, using red lead or cinnabar, both poisonous. Applied to the cheeks, the effect was instant, a glowing, shiny flush that shimmered in candlelight. The downside: rashes, burns, ulcers. Still, as with white lead, many women continued, believing better to die beautiful than live ugly. Blush was also a secret language. A young woman's faintly flushed cheeks could suggest shyness, budding love. or simply good health. At parties and festivals, many girls created their own bashfulness with a dab of blush. Amusingly, many naive young men thought it was a sign of true affection, spinning romantic stories around it. Medieval poetry compared rosy cheeks to morning rose petals or a dim fire in winter nights. Poets praised maidens with cheeks like dawn on snowy fields, reinforcing the idea that beauty needed that fragile pink glow. Yet the same poetry warned, too much blush hinted at demonic seduction or sinful desire. This forced women to walk a razor's edge. Just one brush too many, and you could go from holy maiden to witch in people's eyes. Some women were even accused of prostitution simply for wearing too much blush at a festival. Men, of course, weren't exempt. Some courtiers also wore blush, especially in Italy and France. For them, flushed cheeks signified youth, health, and charm. But again, moderation was everything. A man with cheeks too red would be mocked as effeminate or vulgar. After talking about the subtle blush of rosy cheeks, we can't skip the question, what did they actually use to create that colour? The answer is rouge, one of the most multifaceted and dangerous cosmetics of the Middle Ages. Rouge wasn't just blush. It was a symbol of a whole social game, where women had to carefully choose between safety and allure, between natural pink and seductive red. At its simplest, rouge came from nature. Beets, wild berries, or crushed rose petals were the most common ingredients. They gave a fresh, soft pink that faded quickly but was safe. Practical ladies often hid a cloth soaked in beet juice up their sleeve to discreetly touch up during a banquet. Discreet and effective, but beet colour couldn't deliver explosive allure. It fit only the standard of modesty. For those who wanted to stand out, nature had another option: crushed insects. Cochineal bugs or other red pigmented beetles were dried, ground into powder, and mixed with oil or water to create long-lasting rouge. The result was a vivid red, sometimes with an orange glow, making cheeks shine under candlelight. Don't cringe. Even today, insect-based pigments are still used in cosmetics and food. Only now, they're processed safely. Medieval people, of course, had no concept of safety testing. They just knew the brighter the colour, the more attractive. Then came the truly dangerous recipes, rouge made from red lead or cinnabar. These didn't just add pink, they gave a luminous shine, making faces glow at night banquets. It's no wonder noble women chose them, despite the risks. In a dim room, lit only by candles, a face dusted with red lead rouge looked like a beacon, drawing every eye. The price was inevitable. Both red lead and cinnabar contained toxic heavy metals. Skin irritation, sores, cheeks, inflamed to the point of pain. The poison absorbed through the skin could also cause dizziness, nausea, exhaustion. But like white lead powder, toxic rouge remained popular because the effect was just too stunning compared to safer options. Beauty first, life later. That was the unspoken philosophy. Rouge was also a social language. Soft, even blush suggested shyness and purity, the look of a saint. Meanwhile, blazing red, glossy cheeks could signal boldness, sensuality, or be branded vanity. A woman who balanced rouge just right was praised as refined and tasteful, but a little too much, and she risked being seen as a seductress, or worse, linked to prostitution. Records suggest that in red light districts, heavy rouge was the unspoken uniform of sex workers. That made rouge a double-edged sword, beloved by noble women for beauty, but also a marker of suspicion and gossip. For this reason, many upper-class women used rouge in private or at festivals, but avoided it in daily life to dodge scandal. Men weren't completely absent from the trend. Some courtiers, especially among Italian and French artists and poets, applied light rouge to look youthful and charming, but it had to be extremely subtle. A man with too red cheeks would be mocked as too feminine or vulgar. In art and literature, rouge always appeared as an ambiguous symbol, a sign of life, but also of dangerous desire. Poets praised cheeks red as peach blossoms in snow, but warned that flaming cheeks are the mark of the devil's temptation. There was no clear line, and that ambiguity made rouge the centre of endless debate. Seen through modern eyes, medieval rouge was basically the primitive version of high-risk, high-reward makeup. Today, we have safe cream and powder blushes, in shades from soft pink to wine red. But the obsession hasn't changed. Blush still symbolizes vitality, love, and allure. The irony is that something so simple, the natural flush of blood rising under the skin when we're moved or active, was turned into a standard that had to be artificially recreated. Instead of accepting natural beauty, medieval people mixed chemicals, crushed insects, even smeared toxins just to imitate what the body already did. It's proof of how irrational beauty standards have always been. Rouge, in that sense, was more than blush. It was the emblem of an age where women were trapped between the desire to be admired and the fear of being condemned. A pink cheek could open doors to marriage, status, power, but also lead to ridicule or moral suspicion. That's why every time a noblewoman dabbed rouge before a mirror, it wasn't just beauty, it was a gamble with her social fate. Another key element was hair, and in the medieval beauty picture, blonde hair became the ultimate standard, seen as the symbol of purity, holiness, and even social power. In a world ruled by religion, the Virgin Mary was often painted with light, golden hair falling over her shoulders. That image created an ideal. Blonde hair was tied to innocence, purity, and closeness to heaven. A woman with golden hair wasn't just pretty, she was believed to carry a piece of divine light on her body. And so, the desire for blonde hair spread across Europe, even in regions where black and brown hair were the natural norm. But how to turn dark hair blonde? Medieval people had no shortage of ideas. The most popular dye recipe was a mix of saffron, honey, and lemon juice applied to the hair and then hours of sitting under the sunday. It sounds gentle, but remember saffron was insanely expensive, sometimes more than real gold, so only the rich nobility could afford it. Imagine noble women on castle balconies, hair slathered in golden paste, sitting in the sun all afternoon. That was a common sight. The cheaper recipes were scarier. In some places, people used wood ash mixed with urine to bleach hair. The smell alone was horrifying. But to them, stench was nothing compared to the dream of golden strands. Other methods included vinegar with alum, which left hair dry, brittle, but temporarily lighter. Interestingly, in medieval Italy and France, special sun hats appeared, called solana. These covered the head completely, leaving only sections of hair exposed. Women would wear the hat, coat the hair with dye, and sit in the sunday. The exposed strands bleached, while the rest was protected. Think of it as the primitive version of a modern hair steamer, except instead of electricity and steam, it was sunlight and crude chemicals. In poetry and art, blonde hair became a favorite metaphor for purity and allure. Poets compared women's hair to a river of light, or the golden threads of heaven. Noble portraits showed maidens with shining blonde hair flowing under delicate veils. Combined with pale skin, painted veins, rosy cheeks, and golden hair, the image became almost otherworldly. But the standard came with ironic consequences. Naturally blonde women could be praised as close to God, yet also branded as dangerous seductresses. In folklore, witches and betrayers sometimes had blonde hair, proof of the fear that too much beauty could tempt people into sin. Men weren't immune either. Young knights, eager to look refined, sometimes bleached their hair lighter. In Norse culture, blonde hair was tied to heroic myth, making it even more desirable. Still, male hair dyeing was less common, since society often saw it as vain and unmanly. Socially, blonde hair was a class marker. Peasants didn't have the time or means to follow elaborate dye rituals. That meant gleaming blonde locks were usually assumed to belong to nobles. Appearing at a banquet with golden hair wasn't just about beauty, it was flaunting status. Compared to today, medieval blonde trends were basically the same as bleaching and going platinum blonde now. People still sat in the sun, still used harsh chemicals, still risked damage for a fashionable look. The only difference is, today we have conditioners, masks, and repair treatments, while medieval women had nothing but sun, wind, and the hope their hair wouldn't all fall out before reaching the standard. After blonde hair was praised as sacred and noble, the question became, how could women achieve it when most Europeans had brown, black, or ash-grey hair? The answer lay in bizarre dye recipes, a mix of creativity, superstition, and reckless daring. Manuscripts from the 14th-15th centuries record countless formulas. Some sound reasonable, others make modern readers shudder. The most common ingredient was saffron. the spice so rare it was called red gold. They ground saffron threads, mixed them with honey, vinegar, and sometimes egg yolk. The paste was spread on hair and left under the sun for hours. The result? Golden strands with a sweet scent. But the cost was astronomical. A jar of saffron for dye could equal a peasant's fortune. Those who couldn't afford saffron turned to cheaper solutions. One popular formula was wood ash mixed with urine, believed to cleanse both sin and hair pigment. Picture noble women sitting in summer sun, hair soaked in urine, the perfect illustration of how far beauty standards could push people. Another recipe used alum mixed with vinegar. It stripped the cuticle, lightening the hair, but left it dry, brittle, and stinking sour. Some women wrapped perfumed silk scarves around their heads to hide the odor, turning their hair into a mobile experiment. Others added herbs and flowers for golden tones, chamomile, rosemary, even boiled onions. They believed natural pigments would soak into hair. On festival days, some women went for temporary dye by rubbing turmeric or saffron straight onto their hair, the medieval version of spray-on color. And then came formulas beyond logic. Italian texts from the 15th century mentioned smearing a mix of animal blood, sulfur powder, and wine on hair, then sun-drying it. The belief was sulfur's heat would activate blondness. The result? Scorched hair, blistered scalps, but occasionally a few strands turned lighter. Dyeing wasn't just beauty, it was social and religious. Blonde hair, linked to the Virgin Mary and holiness, also marked nobility. Enduring pain for golden hair wasn't only about beauty, it was about declaring status. Shining blonde locks at a festival said, "I am different from the crowd of dark-haired commoners." The irony was that efforts often backfired. Some ladies overused chemicals until hair fell out in clumps, forcing them to wear veils for months. Others ended up with burnt orange or blotchy yellow hair, becoming objects of mockery. But instead of giving up, they kept experimenting, convinced next time will work. Poetry and art kept glorifying blonde hair, piling on pressure. When poets wrote, "Her hair more golden than ripe wheat," every dark-haired woman felt unlucky, and some were willing to risk anything to reach the ideal. Compared to today, medieval hair dyeing was basically the primitive version of salon bleaching. Modern people sit under lamps with industrial chemicals. Medieval women had only sun, vinegar, sulfur, and blind faith. What makes it all fascinating is the randomness and absurdity. From luxurious saffron to ash, urine, or animal blood, everything became dye. Each recipe showed both limitless imagination and sheer desperation under social pressure. But hair wasn't only about color. Once it was blonde, women had to style, cover, or flaunt it according to class and morality. And that's where veils, hennin hats, and strange hair ornaments entered the stage, opening a new chapter in the story of beauty. Beyond hair color, the way hair was worn was just as important. In the Middle Ages, loose hair wasn't simply a personal choice. It was a declaration of marital status and virtue. In a tightly bound feudal society, a woman's hair was tied to her purity and her family's honor. Unmarried girls were allowed to wear their hair long, loose down their back, or in simple braids. This was seen as a sign of youth, innocence, and fertility. A girl appearing in church or at a festival with long, light hair flowing freely instantly drew eyes. Countless poems praised golden hair streaming like fields of wheat in the sun, treating it as the purest image of youth. But that freedom ended with marriage. Once a woman wed, her hair almost disappeared from public view. Social and religious rules demanded wives cover their hair, calling it an act of modesty and loyalty. From that moment, hair no longer belonged to the woman herself, but to her husband, her family, and even the community. That made loose hair a fleeting moment of freedom. A girl had only a few years in life to feel the wind through her hair before it was buried under veils, caps, or hennins. That's why, at weddings, the sight of a bride walking into church with her hair flowing long carried sacred meaning. It was the last time the community would see her as free, before that hair was forever hidden. Art reflected this clearly. Paintings of the young Virgin Mary or saints often showed loose, soft hair as a symbol of purity. In contrast, depictions of wives or widows always showed hair concealed under veils and headdresses. A small detail, but one instantly told viewers the story behind the figure. Interestingly, Loose hair also carried a hidden sexual signal. Though wrapped in layers of religious symbolism, society still admitted that hair was one of a woman's most alluring features. Records say men could be enchanted simply by a maiden removing her veil and letting her golden hair fall in the wind. Because of that, wearing hair loose in public could be seen as provocative, even rebellious. The irony was that strict rules gave loose hair even more power. When a girl wore her hair down at a festival, it wasn't just style, it was a statement. I'm still free. I still have choices. Many married noblewomen later tried to reclaim that feeling by letting a few strands slip out under their veils, a small act of rebellion within the rules. Men, of course, understood this symbolism. In many love songs, the moment a lover let her hair down marked a confession of love or a pledge of marriage. Hair, in that sense, wasn't just physical. It was romantic language. Seen from today's perspective, loose hair in the Middle Ages was like a fashion statement. Not just a style, but a social signal everyone could read. A maiden with flowing hair equals unmarried. A wife with covered hair equals belonging to another family. That clarity helped small medieval communities keep order, but it also stripped women of the freedom to decide their own image. Loose hair, then, was more than aesthetic. It was a symbol of youth, freedom, and fragility. It reminds us that beauty in the Middle Ages was always chained by strict norms. And from the moment that hair was covered after marriage, a new chapter began, where veils, hennins, and the art of concealment took center stage. If loose hair was the privilege of maidens, then after marriage, a woman's entire world of beauty in the Middle Ages shifted into a new chapter, the art of covering hair. And in this chapter, two main characters always appeared, the wimple, veil, and the hennin, not just fashion items, but symbols of status, religion, and social power. The wimple began as a long piece of cloth wrapped around the head and neck, leaving only the face exposed. It had a practical use: warmth, protection from dust, and Sunday, but soon it became a sign of modesty. A wife who covered her hair with a wimple was praised as pious, virtuous, and loyal to her husband. On the other hand, if too much hair was shown, the woman could be branded vain, even immoral. The church reinforced this by insisting that hair was the devil's temptation and must be covered. But medieval society never stopped at simplicity. From plain cloths, noble women began turning wimples into portable works of art. Pure white fabric, stiffened with starch or egg whites, formed elaborate folds around the face. Some were embroidered with lace, edged with pearls, or trimmed with gold. What started as a symbol of humility quietly became a hidden runway of extravagance. The peak of this art was, of course, the hennin, the tall, cone-shaped hat so often seen in paintings and fairy tales. Hennins could reach from 30 centimeters to over a meter high, standing upright like Gothic spires. From the tip, a thin veil flowed down, hiding hair while creating a surreal aura. Walking into a hall, a lady in a hennin looked like she was carrying a cathedral tower on her head, turning every head around. To wear a hennin, hair had to be tightly pinned and wrapped flat to the scalp, sometimes bound with cords for balance. Moving around became a challenge. Bow too low, and the hennin toppled. Step through a doorway, and it might snag on the beam. One story tells of a French lady whose hennin caught on a chandelier, throwing a banquet into chaos. But instead of abandoning them, women only doubled down. Hennins became symbols of power. If you could carry a tower on your head and still look elegant, you proved yourself truly noble. Height and complexity became measures of rank. The more powerful the lady, the taller her hennin, the more layers of veil and jewels. In some courts, rules had to be issued to limit hennin size for fear of excess. But bans only made them more desirable. What's forbidden always becomes the next luxury. While hennins dominated Western Europe, other regions developed their own styles. In England and Germany, women favoured coifs, tight-fitting cloth caps, often paired with outer veils. In Italy, hair could be intricately braided and tucked under golden or silver nets. Whatever the form, the rule was the same. Hair must be hidden, leaving fabric, lace, and jewels to take the spotlight. And here lies the paradox. Hair, the very symbol of vitality and beauty, was concealed, while the fabric covering it became the centre of display. Yet that paradox reinforced the social message. True beauty didn't belong to nature, but to control and standardization. The more a woman concealed, the more she proved herself devout and worthy of noble rank. Seen with modern eyes, hennins and wimples were the medieval version of haute couture hats, the bizarre creations on today's fashion runways. Not meant for practicality, but for show, for spectacle, for declaring, "I have the power to ignore inconvenience." But beyond fashion, they carried a deeper symbolism. Wimples and hennins weren't just accessories. They were invisible barriers. They drew sharp lines. Maidens with loose hair equals free, unmarried. Wives with wimples and hennins equals already claimed, bound by society. And this division led into the next chapter, where hair, though hidden, still found ways to shine through elaborate hair jewelry and intricate buns, turning a woman's head into a living work of art. When wimples and hennins covered every strand of hair, medieval women still refused to let their heads look too plain. That's when hair jewelry appeared, a clever way to both obey the rules and flaunt wealth and power. Gold, silver, gemstones, all placed on the head, turning hair, even when hidden, into a living canvas of luxury. The most basic pieces were combs and pins. At first, they were practical tools to keep hair neatly bound, but soon they were crafted from precious metals, engraved with intricate designs, and even set with pearls or jewels. A glittering hairpin under candlelight didn't just keep a hennin steady. It declared, "My family is so wealthy, we can turn everyday objects into done art." Beyond pins, golden hairnets, cawls, became wildly popular. Hair was braided into a bun and tucked inside fine metal mesh, studded with pearls or gems. These nets both concealed hair, as modesty demanded, and made a woman's head look like a crown. 15th century Italian paintings show Florentine women wearing exquisite golden cawls, sometimes paired with long silk ribbons trailing over their shoulders. Gemstone chains also wrapped around wimples or hennins, creating shimmering outlines. Some ladies even wore pearl necklaces, not around their necks but across their heads, so that every movement made light dance. The effect was queenly, almost divine. And jewelry wasn't just for women. Noblemen, especially knights and princes, wore jeweled circlets across their hair or hats. Less elaborate than women's adornments, yes, but still powerful signals of class. A simple golden band was enough to tell who was noble and who was common. In society, these ornaments carried symbolic meaning. A pin shaped like a cross proclaimed piety. A pearl-studded caul suggested purity. Rubies or emeralds evoked passion and power. A woman's head wasn't just accessorized, it spoke a visual language, signaling her class, personality, even secret intentions. One story tells of a French lady who dazzled at a banquet wearing a hairpin shaped like a dove in white gold. Everyone understood. It wasn't just jewelry, it was her public statement of innocence, whispered to the whole court. Meanwhile, rebellious ladies sometimes chose dragon, serpent, or flame motifs, flaunting their fiery character. Of course, extravagance brought criticism. The church scolded women for turning their heads into treasure chests, calling it vanity and a distraction from faith. But instead of backing down, noble women doubled their creativity. When forbidden from wearing certain necklaces, they shifted jewels to their hair. When hennins were mocked for being too tall, they compensated by sewing gems into veils. Every church band became fresh fuel for fashion innovation. Seen today, medieval hair jewelry was the ancestor of modern runway accessories. Crystal hair clips, jeweled crowns, haute couture headpieces. They weren't just about beauty, but about status, spectacle, and ensuring every eye turned toward the wearer. And here lies the irony. While hair, once the symbol of femininity, was hidden, the ornaments above it became the new emblem of allure. Beauty no longer rested in nature, but in society's ability to package and transform it into display. And of course, the game didn't stop at jewelry. Alongside covering hair and decorating it with gold and silver, medieval women also developed elaborate buns, styled to peek through veils and hennins, forming striking shapes. That was when hair truly became sculpture, opening a new chapter in the art of shaping the human body. From a very young age, many noble girls were trained to achieve the ideal tiny waist. This didn't just begin when they reached adulthood. Even in their early teens, they were forced to get used to the waist cincher, the ancestor of the corset. Early waist cinching wasn't just fashion. It was a tool to mold the body to class standards, sometimes so brutal it deformed ribs and organs. These early cinchers were made of thick, coarse fabric, lined with slats of wood, whalebone, or even metal. They wrapped tightly around the torso and were pulled shut with laces at the back. Mothers or nursemaids usually did the lacing, sometimes needing servants to help. Picture a 13 or 14-year-old girl standing in the middle of a room, gripping a chair, while the laces were pulled tighter and tighter until her breathing turned shallow. That was the beginning of a beauty journey she could never escape. The sole goal: create a waist smaller than reality. As the laces pulled, fat and ribs compressed, the chest lifted, and hips appeared more prominent. This was the celebrated silhouette: a hand-span waist, full breasts, rounded hips, the embodiment of both nobility and fertility. But the cost was severe. Wearing a cincher so young prevented rib cages and lungs from developing properly. Medical notes from the time describe cases of abnormally flat chests, narrow shoulders, but protruding lower bellies, the result of a body continuously crushed during puberty. Some girls developed chronic breathing problems, fainting at feasts or dances simply because they couldn't get enough air. Ironically, fainting became fashionable. A lady so delicate she walked slowly, breathed shallowly, and collapsed under candlelight was proof she didn't labour. A peasant woman in the fields couldn't faint at noon. Only nobles had the privilege of being too fragile to stand. Beyond health, waist cinching was also social control. It shaped not only bodies but behaviour. A girl bound at the waist couldn't run, climb, or do heavy work. She stood straighter, walked slower, sat with legs together. In other words, the waist cincher turned her body into a mobile cage, forcing her to perform proper conduct. For this reason, cinchers became a tool of moral discipline. Some mothers believed putting their daughters in them early stopped them from being rowdy or ashamed of a rough figure. They called it an investment in the future, since a small waist meant higher chances of a good marriage. In noble families, the smaller the waist, the greater the prospects of marrying into prestige. Some accounts even describe waist training as a ritual. Each morning, servants dressed the girls, pulling the laces a little tighter. Then the girls practiced walking, balancing books on their heads, bowing without loosening the laces. It was like a body training program, designed to turn them into living symbols of beauty standards. Of course, not everyone approved. Some doctors and priests condemned early cinching as against nature and God's will. They warned of damaged health, infertility, even early death. But such warnings were rarely heeded. Social pressure was stronger. When the entire court celebrated wasp waists, who dared appear natural? Class differences were clear here too. Peasant women rarely used cinchers. They had to work the fields, carry loads, and couldn't be bound by stiff garments. Their natural waists became markers. Nobles had tiny waists, peasants had larger ones. Once again, the body became a social passport that couldn't be forged. From today's perspective, early waist cinching was the primitive version of body training with waist trainers, shapewear, or even cosmetic surgery. Like now, reshaping the body was seen as a fair price for beauty. The difference is, today, it's a choice. In the Middle Ages, it was nearly mandatory. The scariest part: many young women grew up so dependent on cinchers that once removed, their bodies couldn't hold themselves. Spines curved, muscles weakened, ribs deformed. They became lifelong prisoners of the garment. Some even continued cinching after pregnancy to hide bellies, risking deadly complications for both mother and child. And so, what seemed like a simple beauty accessory became shackles of body and spirit. It forced women not only to live within beauty standards, but to perform daily the image of being fragile and noble. The eyes were the very center of the face, and when a woman's words were limited, her gaze became a secret language, a soft weapon with real power. People believed that beautiful eyes could speak more than 100 words, serving as a tool of emotional communication, a measure of beauty, and a danger that could drive men mad. The ideal eyes, as described in poetry, were large, deep, and luminous. The colour didn't matter. Blue, brown, or grey could all be beautiful. What mattered was that the gaze evoked fragility or allure. A modest maiden kept her gaze lowered, glancing only briefly to show humility. Meanwhile, a confident lady was praised for eyes, with fire, as if they pierced straight through the heart of anyone she looked at. To enhance their eyes, medieval women weren't afraid of strange tricks. One of the most famous was using belladonna, the deadly nightshade. A few drops of its extract in the eyes dilated the pupils, creating the doe-eyed look, wide, shimmering, and seductive. But belladonna was poison. It caused blurred vision, pain, even blindness if overused. Still, many women took the risk, because big, round eyes were seen as symbols of innocence and charm. Beyond belladonna, there were simpler tricks like salt or onions to provoke tears. Slightly watery, red-rimmed eyes were thought to suggest weakness and stir men's protective instincts. The image of a maiden with tearful eyes, flushed cheeks, and trembling lips became a classic motif in love poetry. There were also basic makeup methods. Women used charcoal or ash to darken the eye line, deepening the gaze. Though not as common as in Egypt or the Middle East, records show kohl was imported for beauty in wealthy courts of Europe. Fascinatingly, eyes weren't just seen as the center of beauty, but also as mirrors of morality. People believed a gaze revealed the soul. Clear, steady eyes equals honesty and purity. Shifty or sharp eyes equals deceit, even evil. Many witch trials condemned women simply because their eyes were judged devious or bewitching. The phrase witch's gaze came from the fear that a single look could curse someone. In chivalric poetry, eyes were the language of love. A knight might praise his lover's gaze as piercing my heart like a spear, or sparkling like stars in a dark night. Many romances began with a glance in church, where words were forbidden, but eyes could cross barriers. The eyes became the bridge between modesty and atuvai, desire. But that's also why eyes were a battlefield of contradictions. On one hand, society praised them as treasures, urging women to care for them. On the other, religion warned that eyes were the gateway to sin. Church sermons often insisted, women must not gaze at men too long, for the eye is the devil's arrow. Women walked a fragile line, using their eyes to attract, but feigning modesty to avoid condemnation. Eyes also tied into health and nutrition. In a world of disease and famine, bright, clear eyes meant vitality. Cloudy, yellowed eyes signaled illness and lowered marriage prospects. This drove women to care for their eyes, with rosewater rinses and herbal poultices to preserve clarity. And compared to modern times, the link is obvious. Contact lenses, mascara, even pupil-dilating drops in photo shoots are safer versions of those medieval experiments. The formula for beauty hasn't changed. Big, bright, sparkling, full of emotion. What made medieval eyes unique, though, was their social role. When women's voices were silenced, their eyes became the one place they could express thoughts and desires. A lowered glance could confess love, a cold stare could reject, and a pair of speaking eyes, even in silence, could make society listen. Caring for the eyes naturally became its own art, and that art didn't stop at using belladonna to dilate the pupils or charcoal to line the lids. It included a whole range of tricks, sometimes refined, sometimes bizarre, sometimes dangerous, all aimed at turning the eyes into the hypnotic center of the face. One of the most popular tricks was whitening the sclera. People believed beautiful eyes had to be clear, sparkling, with no bloodshot veins. To achieve this, women used countless eye washes, rose water, distilled herbs, or stranger concoctions like children's urine, which was thought to be pure and clean. Some recipes even recommended dropping diluted wine directly into the penis, eyes to disinfect and brighten. Imagine noble ladies tearing up from the sting, just to have eyes clear as crystal at a banquet. Another trick focused on making tiny veins in the eyes more visible, opposite to modern standards. Where red eyes suggest illness or fatigue, the Middle Ages sometimes saw slightly reddened eyes as seductive, evoking fragility and vulnerability. So women deliberately rubbed their eyes with dirty fingers, inhaled incense smoke, or applied onion juice to keep their gaze glistening and bloodshot. Shimmering, tearful eyes under candlelight could convince men that the woman was truly moved. There were also methods to make eyes look bigger. Beyond belladonna, women traced black lines with ash or charcoal around the lids. The contrast made the iris look larger. Though less sophisticated than Egyptian kohl, in a European society obsessed with holiness, Bold black lines made the gaze pop against pale white skin. Some tricks even involved eyelashes. While many women plucked them to leave the eyes bare and fragile looking, others chose to emphasize them. They mixed charcoal with olive oil and brushed it onto lashes for a deeper, sharper gaze. Some even used tree resin to stiffen and curl them, a primitive form of mascara. The risk, of course, was resin hardening, gluing lids together, and causing irritation or infection. Often, these eye tricks weren't just personal choices, but social language. Tearful eyes could signal softness, inviting protection. Sharply lined eyes might suggest boldness and allure. By adjusting their eyes, women sent different signals depending on context. Modest in church, alluring at festivals, dreamy at feasts. That's why eyes became such a favorite subject in art and poetry. Portraits often highlighted luminous gazes, while chivalric poetry endlessly praised eyes that pierce the heart, eyes like pools of water, or eyes that outshine the stars. Beautiful eyes weren't just a physical trait. They symbolized love, temptation, and sometimes sin itself. But like every beauty trend, these eye tricks came with risks. Too much belladonna led to blindness. Harsh washes burned corneas. And still, women endured, because society taught them to believe. Eyes that speak were the key to holding on to love and status. In the portrait of medieval beauty, after the speaking eyes, breath, and the smile were the final details completing a woman's allure. A smile was seen as the mark of grace and refinement, while sweet breath was tied to virtue and self-care. A beautiful woman couldn't lack either, because just one foul breath was enough to shatter the impression, no matter how pale her skin or how bright her eyes. The ideal smile of the time wasn't a wide, radiant grin showing every tooth, but a closed, modest smile, just a slight lift of the lips. A woman who smiled too broadly was thought to be lacking decorum, even loose. So the standard was set. Teeth could peek through, but they should never be fully revealed. This also conveniently covered up the truth that most medieval mouths were far from perfect, with tooth decay, tartar, and bad breath rampant due to poor hygiene. To make that modest smile more alluring, women used many tricks. One was tinting the lips with plants, juices from berries, beets, or crushed rose petals. The soft reds brought life to the lips and contrasted with pale white skin. Rosy lips didn't just signal youth, but also health and vitality, crucial in a society constantly worried about disease. But a smile lost all its power if it wasn't paired with fresh breath. Noble women paid close attention to this, because in long feasts or dances, people stood very close together. If an unpleasant odor escaped, it was a stain on her honor. So countless breath-freshening formulas were born, from simple to elaborate. The most common was chewing fragrant leaves and seeds. Mint, parsley, basil, or fennel, and anise seeds were used like natural mints. Ladies often carried small pouches with resin beads, mastic or pine resin, to chew and release a pleasant scent. In Italy and France, licorice was popular too, soothing the throat while masking odors. More elaborate recipes included herbal wines. People soaked basil, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg in wine, then rinsed their mouths before a banquet. Some records say wealthy ladies even used rosewater mixed with powdered cinnamon, both to cleanse and to leave a sweet fragrance. Breath became like an invisible flower, blooming as they whispered in conversation. There were also folk remedies nobles swore by, chewing dried orange or lemon peels to absorb foul humours, or drinking honey mixed with vinegar to cleanse the stomach and sweeten the breath. Whether effective or not, these rituals gave women confidence whenever they spoke. In chivalric literature, smiles and breath were often praised like magic. Poets wrote that her smile could melt winter's ice, or that her breath was sweeter than Burgundy wine. These weren't just love lines, but reflections of society's belief that smiles and breath truly carried power. What's striking is that smiles carried moral weight too. A woman who smiled at the right time, subtly, was seen as wise and dignified. But laughing too loud, too freely, could be labelled shameless, even dishonourable for her family. That's why in portraits, noble women usually only hinted at a smile, lips slightly parted, never fully grinning. Men weren't exempt from similar rules. Knights and lords were taught to control their smiles, avoiding anything that seemed crude. But women bore the heaviest burden, their smiles judged as measures of virtue, and their breath as proof of refinement. Some medieval medical texts even linked breath to the soul. They believed breath was life force, and foul breath equaled spiritual decay. This reinforced the idea that women had to keep their breath pure to prove their virtue. And when all these elements came together, pale skin, high forehead, shining eyes, a modest smile, and sweet breath, the image of the ideal noblewoman appeared, fragile, dignified, yet still alluring. And to complete that image, medieval society emphasized one more element: her voice. The way she spoke, the words she uttered, would decide if she was truly perfect in the eyes of her world. If the modest smile was the delicate highlight of a medieval woman's face, then the closed teeth were the hidden secret behind that standard. At the time, teeth were rarely straight and white, since poor hygiene meant tooth decay and plaque were common across all classes. And so society built a unique beauty rule: teeth should never be shown too much, and beauty was expressed through discretion rather than display. In noble portraits, women often only parted their lips slightly, just enough to suggest shyness, but never revealing a full set of teeth. The half-closed smile was considered noble, while a wide, toothy grin was seen as improper, even vulgar. This wasn't just moral judgment, it was practical too. Almost no one had a flawless set of teeth worth showing off in public. Still, women had their own tricks to keep their teeth acceptable if they happened to be revealed. The most common method was scrubbing with coarse salt or wood ash. Some even used walnut husks or dried rosemary twigs as makeshift brushes. The results didn't whiten teeth, but they reduced odor and plaque somewhat. The wealthy went further, chewing fragrant resins like mastic or pine, which cleaned the teeth and freshened the breath. Besides scrubbing, primitive tooth powders were also invented. Crushed bone, powdered shells, dried herbs, and salt were mixed together, sometimes with honey added to help the mixture stick to a crude brush made from animal hair tied to a wooden handle. These mixtures sometimes strengthened the teeth, but they could also grind down enamel, leaving teeth sensitive and sore. For noble women, keeping the teeth hidden wasn't just habit, it was an art of manners. When speaking, they were taught to move their lips just enough, never opening too wide. When smiling, the lips should only curve slightly, sometimes even covered with a hand or a kerchief to avoid exposing teeth. This restraint was praised as grace, and it conveniently concealed natural flaws. Many writings praised the closed smile of women as the moon behind clouds, discreet yet alluring. Poets stressed that lips just barely parted preserved mystery, making men all the more eager to discover what lay behind. A toothy grin, by contrast, was compared to harsh light, stripping softness from the face. Even smiling was tightly policed, forcing women to calculate every expression. Closed teeth carried moral and class meaning too. Peasants who ate rough food and drank herbal brews often had chipped or stained teeth that couldn't be hidden. Their wide grins were branded crude. Meanwhile, noble women turned modesty into an aesthetic, making the closed smile a kind of privilege, proof of refinement and rank. Men cared about teeth as well, but the pressure was lighter. Knights focused more on strength and honor. Yet in love poetry, women's teeth were sometimes described as white as ivory, making them rare symbols of divine blessing. Women lucky enough to have naturally beautiful teeth were praised far beyond others, as if God had touched them with favor. For most women, though, that standard was unreachable. The safest solution was to smile little and keep the mouth closed. It wasn't just beauty etiquette. It became part of polite behavior. At feasts and receptions, the woman who smiled discreetly was called refined, while one who laughed openly, exposing yellow or broken teeth, was branded ill-mannered. The closed teeth standard created a distinctive posture for medieval women. From how they smiled to how they spoke, down to every small gesture, all had to be controlled. Beauty wasn't only in skin, hair, or eyes, it also hid within the modesty of the smile. And from there, the story of beauty moved to another chapter, the skin of the body, that white canvas, covering everything, where ideals of purity and fragility reached their extreme. If the standards of beauty for women were drawn in detail from hair to skin to smile, then on the other side, men also had their own set of ideals. Medieval society didn't just obsess over feminine beauty, it also built the image of the ideal man, where appearance, strength, and posture were tied tightly to moral character and social rank. The ideal man, as described in chivalric literature, First had to have a tall, broad-shouldered, upright frame. A strong body wasn't only proof of his ability to work and fight, it symbolized protection for his family and community. Broad shoulders and a wide chest stood for power, while a slim waist showed discipline and training. A man with a sturdy build was often compared to lions, bears, or warriors of myth. Another key standard was the face. In contrast to women praised for pale, white skin, the ideal man was expected to have healthy, sun-touched skin, a sign of bravery on the battlefield. But it had to be balanced. Too dark a tan suggested peasant labor in the fields. For nobles, a sun-warmed but refined face was the perfect middle ground, strong yet still elegant. A man's eyes were thought to reveal his spirit. Poets wrote of eyes shining like steel, or gazing far like eagles. His eyes weren't meant to glisten with shyness like a woman's, but to radiate decisiveness, loyalty, and leadership. In knightly tales, a man's gaze was what made followers trust him, and enemies tremble. Hair mattered too. Noblemen often wore medium-length hair, neatly combed, to show care and rank. Young knights were described with soft curls brushing their shoulders, symbols of charm and vigour. Warriors and common soldiers, by contrast, kept it shorter for battle. Thick, glossy hair meant health. Thinning or balding too soon was seen as unlucky. And then there was the beard. A full, trimmed beard stood for masculinity and maturity. Many kings, lords, and famous knights were depicted with heavy beards and square jaws, radiating authority. But grooming was essential. An unkempt beard meant wildness and lack of discipline. In some regions, though, a clean-shaven face was preferred as a sign of refinement and youth. Standards for beards shifted, but the rule stayed the same. A man's beard reflected his status and way of life. Beyond face and body, a man's hands drew attention too. Strong, firm hands with long, steady fingers marked someone who could wield a sword or draw a bow. At formal gatherings, a firm handshake displayed courage and reliability. Soft hands without calluses could be mocked as weak, unless the man was a monk or scholar, where smooth hands symbolized intellect instead of battle. Clothing reinforced this image. Knights and noblemen wore fitted tunics to show off their frame, topped with long cloaks that broadcast rank. High boots, wide belts, and a sword at the hip weren't just practical, they were symbols of honor. A man walking into a hall in polished armor or an embroidered cloak was instantly recognized as a hero, no matter what his natural looks were. In chivalric poetry and literature, masculine ideals were crystal clear: courage, loyalty, generosity, respect for women. But those virtues were never separate from looks. A man needed an imposing build, sharp eyes, and a resonant voice to truly embody the true knight. Some songs even described exactly how a knight should walk, grip his sword, or laugh loudly. Every detail became a model for young men to follow. Even voice and breath were judged. A deep, clear voice carried authority. At banquets, booming laughter was admired as strength, unlike the gentle giggles expected from women. Sweet breath scented with herbs, wine, or honey was praised, while foul breath was disgraceful. Men too chewed herbs or rinsed with spiced wine to keep their breath pleasant. Above all, male standards of appearance were inseparable from class and role. Knights had to be imposing and strong, courtiers refined and dignified, clergy lean and solemn. Each class had its own expectations, but all agreed on one thing. A man's looks weren't just beauty, they were proof of his rank and duty. Placed alongside the standards for women, the contrast was sharp. Women were expected to be delicate, modest, and reserved, while men had to be bold, powerful, and commanding. From that contrast, medieval society built its entire gender order, where beauty wasn't just personal, it was the foundation for social order. And within that logic, the obsession with skin, the canvas covering both men and women, became the next central chapter in the story of beauty. Hair and beards were the clearest personal signatures of status, style, and character. For nobles, their hair and beard weren't just there to frame the face. They were seen as a banner of honor and lineage. Every detail was carefully maintained, marking a sharp divide between the upper classes and the common crowd. In many European courts, medium-length, well-groomed hair was considered the noble standard. Hair falling to the shoulders, slightly wavy or curled, was often treated with olive oil, animal fat, or herbs to keep it glossy. A man with thick, healthy hair was viewed as the embodiment of vitality and masculinity. In 14th–15th century portraits, noblemen are often shown with dark brown hair, parted down the middle and flowing evenly on both sides, giving a look that was both refined and commanding. For young nobles, especially knights, natural curls were celebrated. Loose waves framing the stuccat face suggested charm, often compared to heroes of Greek mythology, strong yet alluring. Records even describe young noblemen using hot irons or braiding damp hair to fake curls. Hair wasn't just something you grew, it was trained to fit the standard. Too long or too short, though, was seen as wrong. Wildly long hair suggested savagery, while a shaved head hinted at monks or peasants. Nobles needed to strike the just right length, enough to show care and elegance, but distinct from soldiers and farmers. Alongside hair, the beard carried even more symbolic weight. A nobleman's beard wasn't only a mark of maturity, but proof of authority. Full but tidy, carefully trimmed into clear shapes, it reflected discipline and self-control. In France and England, a pointed beard at the chin was popular, giving a stern, commanding look. In Germany and the north, men preferred long, heavy beards covering the chest, symbols of strength and courage. The moustache was equally important. A waxed, curled moustache gave the face sharpness and charisma. Records mention nobles using beeswax to keep their moustaches perfectly shaped during grand ceremonies. Facial hair became a mark of manhood, even a competition. Whoever had the thickest, most elegant moustache was admired most. For many nobles, grooming hair and beard became a daily ritual. Every morning, servants heated oils, brushed hair, smoothed beards, and clipped stray strands. Some wealthy households even hired personal barbers just for the lord. This ritualistic care turned hair and beard into a status marker. The poor simply couldn't afford the time or means to keep hair glossy or beards perfectly trimmed. In noble portraits, hair and beard weren't just features. They carried messages. A king with a long, white beard symbolized wisdom and experience. A young knight with curls and a sharp moustache embodied bravery and readiness for battle. Each style was tied to the role and personality society expected from them. Hair and beards also linked to religion and law. In many monasteries, men had to shave their heads or cut hair short as proof of humility. That made long hair a privilege of nobles and warriors. Some courts even passed laws regulating how beards and hair should be worn to draw clear class lines. In some places, peasants were banned from growing full beards so they wouldn't be mistaken for nobility. Chivalric literature reinforced these ideals. Epic poems often praised the majestic beard or the golden mane of the hero, underscoring the belief that outward appearance reflected inner virtue. A cowardly knight could never be described with a proud beard or heroic hair. Hair and beard even played roles in romance. Poets sang of a young man's soft curls, or the scent of beard oil lingering when he leaned close to his lover. So they weren't only symbols of power, they were sensual details, woven into tales of passion. From sleek, well-kept hair to carefully styled beards, all combined to form the complete noble image. The ideal man wasn't just strong on the battlefield, he had to walk into the banquet hall groomed to perfection. And from these standards of hair and beard, medieval society took the next step in shaping the model man, moving beyond looks into clothing and body adornment, turning the entire person into a mirror of rank and power. Clothing was the tool that shaped the bodies of both men and women in medieval society. Clothes weren't just for warmth or modesty, they were designed to sculpt the ideal figure according to beauty and class standards. Every layer of fabric, every seam, carried meaning, reshaping the body, hiding flaws, highlighting strengths, and above all, displaying status in the community. Noble women used dresses as a multi-layered wall of fabric to sculpt their silhouettes. The innermost layer was usually a long underdress made of linen or thin silk. On top came a heavier gown, often cinched tightly at the waist to create artificial curves. Some styles were cut with a raised waistline to accentuate the bust and make the hips look fuller. Medieval gowns often swept the floor, with extra fabric sewn into the train so that every step made the folds ripple like waves. This created the illusion that a woman was gliding rather than walking, turning her figure into a graceful mirage. Many also wore decorative belts just under the bust or around the waist, adding refinement and elegance to their shape. Corsets in their earliest form were essential, though not as sophisticated as later versions. Strips of stiff fabric and lacing were sewn into undergarments to cinch the waist. As the corset squeezed the torso, the waist shrank while the bust and hips stood out even more. This was the noble ideal, slender yet full, fragile yet fertile. Colour and fabric also defined the silhouette. Flowing silks and velvets created soft elegance, while heavier fabrics gave a straight, imposing shape. Rare shades like deep blue, royal purple, or gold were reserved for the wealthy, cloaking their bodies in an aura of power. For men, clothing also defined and glorified the body. One of the most common garments was the cot, a fitted tunic with long sleeves and slits at the hips for movement. This cut emphasized broad chests, straight shoulders, and narrow waists. Knights and nobles often padded the chest or shoulders with fabric to exaggerate a powerful, muscular look. Over the cot, men wore surcoats or long cloaks. Cloaks didn't just provide warmth, they elongated the figure, making the wearer look taller and more commanding. Cloaks embroidered with coats of arms or trimmed with fur weren't just fashion. They were social declarations of rank and dignity. The belt was a particularly important detail. For men, it wasn't just for fastening clothes. It was pulled tight to highlight the V-shape of broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. From the belt hung the sword, angled at the hip, enhancing the image of masculine authority. In banquet hall paintings, nobles are often shown standing with one hand on the sword hilt, cloak draped open, their figure shaped perfectly by the fabric they wore. Clothing didn't just bind the body, it controlled movement. Long layered skirts forced women to walk slowly, modestly, making them appear graceful and restrained. Tight tunics kept men upright, preventing slouching, projecting power and poise. Every turn, every step was dictated by fabric, turning the wearer into a living stage for beauty standards. Accessories enhanced the effect. Long gloves made women's hands appear slimmer. Pointed shoes gave men a proud, almost arrogant stride. Hoods, veils, and head coverings didn't just conceal, they elongated the lines of the face and figure, adding refinement. Fashioned bodies weren't just about beauty, they were class markers. A peasant could only wear loose, rough fabric for labour, while nobles wrapped themselves in elaborate layers that turned their bodies into displays. Every fold and every hem whispered the same message. I don't work. I belong to the upper class. Clothing also reinforced gender roles. Corseted waists and multi-layered gowns highlighted women's fragility and softness. Tight tunics, heavy armour, and sweeping cloaks underlined men's strength and authority. Together, they mirrored the medieval ideal, men as protectors, women as the protected. Art and poetry immortalized these images. Poets praised her gown flowing like the sea or his cloak sweeping like the eagle's wing. Painters captured every fold of fabric to honor both body and status. Clothing was no longer just daily wear. It became a symbol of art, preserving the beauty ideals of the age. From hair and beards to physique, finely perfected with clothing, medieval people turned their bodies into living works of art. And the picture wouldn't be complete without the final sparkle. Jewelry, gold, silver, and gemstones, transforming appearance into undeniable proof of wealth and power. In an age when clean water wasn't always available, and regular bathing was limited by climate, infrastructure, and even religious beliefs, body odor became a major issue for both men and women in medieval society. This wasn't just about hygiene. Managing scent was tied to honor, class, and attraction. A noble walking into a banquet smelling of pleasant fragrance was worlds apart from a peasant reeking of sweat and mud. Controlling odor was an art the upper classes cared deeply about, and they invented countless ways to mask or transform the body's natural smell. The simplest method was using herbs and flowers. Mint, wormwood, basil, lavender, and roses were rubbed on the skin or tucked into clothing. People believed herbal scents could cover sweat while adding allure. Noble women often carried small silk sachets called pomanders, stuffed with dried flowers and spices, tied to belts or hidden in gowns. As they walked, fragrance drifted out, soothing themselves and sending subtle signals to everyone nearby. Men had their own methods. They rubbed fragrant oils made from tree resin, amber, musk, or ambergris onto their bodies. These ingredients weren't just strong-smelling, they were expensive, signaling wealth. At dances, the scent clinging to a man's cloak or hair became a marker of his rank. A gentleman carrying the fragrance of pine resin and incense wood was nothing like a soldier who smelled only of steel and sweat. Rosewater was also essential. Common in noble households, it was used to wash the face, clean hands, and smooth onto skin. Rosewater didn't just perfume. It cooled the body after hours spent in crowded halls. Women often soaked handkerchiefs in it, tucking them into their sleeves, then raising them to their mouths or noses in conversation. In this way, body odours, theirs or others, were cleverly hidden. Another habit was fumigating clothes and rooms. People burned herbs, resins, or spices in small braziers, then hung garments over the smoke to let them absorb the scent. When worn, the clothes carried lingering fragrance. At long feasts, the scent of perfumed fabrics mingled with the spices in the air, blanketing the hall and masking the natural odours of dozens of tightly packed bodies. Diet played a role too. It was believed that eating fragrant spices, like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, made the body smell more pleasant. Garlic and onions, on the other hand, were the enemies of good scent, so noble women avoided them before ceremonies. Spiced wine was used for rinsing the mouth or sipping before events, both to freshen breath and calm the body. Bathing rituals also shaped scent. While daily baths weren't common, the wealthy often soaked in wooden tubs filled with herb or milk-infused water. In some regions, public bathhouses allowed nobles to relax in warm water laced with flowers and oils. Bathing wasn't just about cleanliness. It was a way to soak up fragrance and carry it for hours afterward. When baths weren't possible, dry bathing was the solution. Servants soaked cloths in rosewater, vinegar, or spiced wine, and rubbed down their masters' bodies. This wiped away sweat while leaving a pleasant aroma. Women especially favoured this method, since heavy multi-layered gowns made full bathing inconvenient. Body odour also reinforced class differences. Peasants and labourers, without access to perfumes, carried the smells of sweat, earth, and livestock. Nobles, by contrast, didn't just mask odour. They turned their bodies into sources of luxurious fragrance. A lady stepping into a room smelling of amber and roses didn't need to say a word to announce her rank. Medieval literature often praised scent alongside looks. Poets described lovers not only by eyes or smiles, but also by breath like spring flowers or hair scented like a meadow breeze. Fragrance was inseparable from allure. A person's beauty wasn't just seen, it was breathed in. In medieval society, where muddy roads, livestock pens, and damp, musty smells surrounded daily life, shoes weren't just protection for the feet. They became part of the art of managing scent and preserving refinement. One of the most common habits among nobles and wealthy townsfolk was placing dried flowers and herbs inside their shoes, both to mask unpleasant odours and to create a sense of comfort while walking. People back then quickly realised that feet were the body's greatest source of odour. Shoes were worn for hours, often soaked in mud and sweat. Made from coarse leather or thick cloth, they were rarely breathable, so smells built up fast. The simplest solution was filling them with strongly scented plants. Rosemary, mint, lavender, sage, wormwood, and even dried rose petals were tucked into shoes before going out. Each step pressed the herbs, releasing a faint fragrance around the wearer. This wasn't only about odour. Many believed herbs had medical benefits. Sage and mint were thought to absorb moisture and prevent foot fungus. Orris root and dried ginger were sometimes ground into powder and sprinkled in shoes to help blood circulation and keep feet warm in winter. In some regions, mugwort leaves were placed in shoes as charms against evil spirits and illness on long journeys. A pair of shoes filled with herbs wasn't just fragrant, it was a talisman. At long feasts or ceremonies, stepping into a hall with scent wafting from one's shoes was considered a mark of refinement. When a nobleman bowed or a lady lifted her gown climbing steps, the whiff of lavender or roses made them all the more alluring. Chroniclers note that many noble women even carried small packets of herbs to replace during the evening, ensuring their fragrance never faded. Monasteries and churches encouraged this practice too, but with a spiritual twist. Monks often lined their shoes with rosemary or jasmine to stay alert through long prayers, believing the pure scent of herbs lifted the soul and chased away fatigue. So placing flowers in shoes wasn't only luxury, it was part of devotion. In cities where markets and streets reeked of refuse, animal waste and dirty water, herb-scented shoes became an invisible shield. Travellers felt comforted knowing their own bodies gave off pleasant scents instead of absorbing foul ones. On long journeys between castles, perfumed shoes not only soothed tired feet, but also signalled social standing. Only the well-off could afford to walk on a bed of flowers. The nobles' fastidiousness showed in how they mixed herbs. It wasn't just stuffing leaves inside, it was creating recipes. Lavender for calm, rosemary for strength, roses for love, mint for freshness. Some women stitched little sachets to tuck inside shoe linings so the fragrance lingered even after the shoes came off. Some men sprinkled orris powder in their shoes for a soft, lasting aroma. Beyond practicality, this reflected medieval aesthetics. People believed the human body should harmonize with nature, and the simplest way was to carry nature with every step. A lady whose shoes gave off a floral trail seemed to walk through an invisible garden. It was uplifting for the spirit, and marked her as distinctly noble, far removed from the peasantry, who knew only the stench of leather and sweat. This detail found its way into literature too. Love songs spoke of someone who passed by and left the scent of meadows behind, a nod to herbs in shoes. In courtly romances, the fragrance of a lady's footsteps was described as a secret trace, driving suitors mad with longing. Shoes filled with herbs became a symbol of presence, subtle yet unforgettable. Simple as it was, lining shoes with flowers and herbs left a lasting mark on medieval aesthetics. It revealed the desire not only to hide the body's flaws, but to turn even the smallest detail into a declaration of class and allure. In a world where beauty standards were carefully constructed and tightly bound to social hierarchy, an unspoken but vital rule emerged. Beautiful, but not too beautiful. A woman or man whose looks outshone everyone else wasn't seen as blessed but as dangerous. Excessive beauty became a double-edged sword, an advantage, yes, but also a cause for suspicion, envy, and even disaster. For women, just enough beauty was the ideal. A noble lady with golden hair, pale, smooth skin, sparkling eyes, and a slender figure would be praised as the embodiment of the standard. But if she drew too much attention, she might be labelled a dangerous temptation. The church often preached that women who were too beautiful were tools of the devil, meant to lead men astray. Many women were accused of witchcraft simply because their beauty was considered beyond the norm. Medieval literature often mentioned women whose beauty was excessive. These characters were usually trapped in tragedy, admired for their looks but envied as well. A duchess so beautiful that even the king desired her could become the spark for conflict, her very beauty turning into a curse. People believed that in beauty too perfect lurked danger, because it disrupted the order maintained by standards of moderation. Men weren't exempt either. A knight who was handsome, well-proportioned, and bright-faced could be admired, but if he appeared too flawless, he risked being seen as vain. In chivalric tales, some men were mocked for caring too much about their hair, beard, or clothes, leading others to view them as superficial or dishonest. For men, beauty was meant to inspire trust. Too much beauty, on the other hand, hinted at deceit. This idea of not too beautiful was also tied to marriage and social stability. A wife so beautiful that her husband worried constantly could be seen as a threat. A husband too charming could stir jealousy and conflict. That's why noble families, when arranging marriages, often considered the bride or groom should be attractive enough to show status, but not so beautiful that they drew dangerous attention. It was a strategy to maintain balance and avoid scandal in courtly and family life. Another layer was the link between beauty and morality. Medieval society believed beauty was a gift from God, but if it was excessive, it could lead to pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. Men and women deemed too beautiful were often reminded to live humbly, hide some of their looks, or show virtue in behavior to offset it. Noble women, for example, might wear more modest clothing or act sternly to avoid being accused of flaunting their beauty. Religious art reflected this idea. Saints were portrayed as beautiful, but with a pure, non-seductive beauty. Their looks drew admiration but didn't provoke desire. It was the safe level of beauty, enough to suggest holiness, not enough to distract from faith. This was the model society embraced. Beautiful, but within acceptable bounds. Daily life reflected the same restraint. Women could use lead powder to whiten their faces, but not so much that it looked unnatural. They could tint lips with roses or beets, but not so red that it dominated the face. Men could grow long beards, but if the mustache was styled too extravagantly, it became ridiculous rather than regal. Even in poetry, the ideal of beautiful but not too beautiful appeared. Songs praised bright eyes, pale skin, and golden hair, but rarely described a person as overwhelmingly perfect. Beauty was often compared to soft moonlight, or the first bloom of spring. Gentle, modest, never dazzling to the point of imbalance. Restraint was the core of the medieval spirit. Beauty had to exist within limits, so it wouldn't shatter social and moral order. This also explains why medieval society sometimes favoured subtle charm over overwhelming glamour. A modest smile, a speaking glance, or slightly radiant skin was prized more than a flawless, dazzling face. Discreet beauty was seen as lasting, while excessive beauty sparked envy and often led to tragedy. The rule of beautiful, but not too beautiful, gave medieval beauty standards their distinct character. It wasn't just about celebrating ideal features, but about enforcing moderation and boundaries. Beauty wasn't allowed to overflow. It couldn't threaten morality, marriage, or the community's balance. And from there, society built further layers, not just appearance and scent, but behaviour, humility, and composure, those invisible ornaments that completed the portrait of medieval beauty. Beauty has never been just a simple gift. It's a double-edged sword bringing privilege and opportunity, yet always carrying the risk of tragedy. A beautiful woman could be lifted up as a symbol, a poet's muse, the one knights fought to protect. But at the same time, that very beauty made her vulnerable to slander, suspicion, even becoming the victim of accusations and jealousy. The story of beauty always came hand in hand with power. Many women entered palaces through their looks, becoming wives or lovers of kings. Beauty gave them a voice in politics, the ability to sway great decisions. A graceful smile could open doors that decades of service never would. Yet because of this, beauty also became the excuse to belittle them. People would claim their success came not from intellect or effort, but only from their face and figure. Many powerful women were recorded in history with harsh judgment, their beauty tied to the charge of using looks to seduce power. Among common folk, a pretty young girl could become the centre of attention in her village. But that also meant facing scrutiny and envy. More than once, beautiful women were accused of witchcraft simply because they made men swoon or provoked jealousy in other women. In heresy trials, beauty itself sometimes served as evidence against them. An unusual loveliness was seen as proof of a pact with the devil. Men weren't spared either. A knight too charming, admired by many, could stir suspicion among comrades, branded as vain or dangerous. In the halls of nobility, a man whose looks drew too much attention might be seen as too seductive, and therefore untrustworthy. Beauty brought admiration, but it also made him a target of harsher scrutiny. Beauty could even ignite political and social disasters. Wars, schemes, and rivalries were often traced back to a single beautiful face. People told stories of how a noblewoman's smile or glance could shake alliances and set kings against one another. In such cases, beauty no longer belonged to the individual. It became a treasure fought over, a tool to be exploited. What's striking is that medieval beauty always came with the duty to uphold an image. A beautiful woman wasn't simply admired. She was expected to live in a way that matched her looks. She had to smile softly, walk lightly, dress modestly, speak with restraint. If she failed, beauty backfired. Instead of praise, she was labelled vain or immoral. The more beautiful she was, the tighter the chains of behaviour bound her. In literature and art, this two-edged beauty appeared again and again. Poets described beauty as a flame that warmed but also burned. Princesses and noble ladies in stories often ended up at extremes, either praised as saints or condemned as destroyers simply because they were too beautiful. Some characters were portrayed as both holy and dangerous, embodying beauty's double nature. Religion added even more contradiction. On one hand, beauty was admitted to be a gift from God, a sign of harmony in creation. On the other, preachers warned that beauty led to sin, fanned desire, and endangered the soul. Women who were too beautiful were often forced into humility, pressured to hide their radiance. The lovelier they were, the more responsibility they bore to prove they were not instruments of the devil. At court, beauty was even more perilous. A queen could symbolize the glory of a dynasty, but she could also be hated, even deposed, if she caused discord. Consorts, whose beauty shone too brightly, often became pawns in power struggles, victims of endless rivalry. Many tragedies in history began with a woman whose looks drew too much attention. That's why medieval society saw beauty as a fragile kind of wealth. It could pave the way to honor and riches, but it could just as easily drag its owner into ruin. People admired and feared beauty at the same time. It was desired, but also condemned. Anyone blessed with extraordinary looks had to live in a delicate balance, using it just enough, while hiding it just enough, to survive. Beauty was never just about appearances. It was seen as a reflection of morality and the soul. People believed that a harmonious face, a balanced figure, a clear gaze were proof that their owner was pure and virtuous. On the other hand, ugliness, deformity, or imbalance were taken as signs of sin, lust, or even the devil's touch. Beauty and morality were tied together, becoming the measure by which society judged people. From church to court, sermons and texts reinforced this belief. Clergy insisted that God created the world in harmony, and when a person was born with a graceful face and symmetrical body, it was proof they were closer to divine will. To be beautiful was to have a shining soul, blessed by God. Many saints were described in hagiographies as radiant in appearance, their beauty treated as holy light that could not be stained by earthly desire. In contrast, those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or enmity against the church were often described as ugly: hooked noses, rough skin, hunched backs, dark eyes. These weren't random details, they were the deliberate ways of linking appearance to morality. It was easy to believe that a frightening face also hid a sinful soul. In chivalric literature, the bond between beauty and virtue was even clearer. The ideal woman princess, noble lady, or knight's beloved was always painted as flawless. White skin, shining hair, a graceful walk, all signals of purity and loyalty. Villains and traitors, on the other hand, were drawn with twisted, strange features. Readers could immediately tell who was good and who was bad just by their looks. Even in marriage and family life, beauty was tied directly to virtue. A beautiful wife was seen as a gift, not only because she pleased the eye, but because she embodied chastity, diligence, and devotion. Meanwhile, a woman judged as ugly was assumed to be lazy, selfish, or sharp-tongued. These stereotypes were unfair, but they lasted because society wanted beauty to serve as a shortcut for morality. In reality, many took advantage of this link to protect their status. A noble woman with striking looks could more easily prove her virtue, because society assumed a graceful appearance couldn't belong to a corrupt soul. In heresy trials, some women were spared simply because they had gentle faces, while others with harsher features were condemned without proof. For nobles, the bond between beauty and morality was also tied to power. A king who was handsome, tall, with a symmetrical face, was more easily accepted as a just ruler. By contrast, rulers with odd or deformed features were seen as bad omens for the kingdom. Some records even claim dynasties declined because the king's appearance showed that God had withdrawn his blessing. Even medieval medicine echoed this belief. Physicians thought the symmetry of face and body reflected the balance of the four humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. A beautiful body meant good health and a calm temperament, while ugliness was the result of disorder in both body and soul. Love poetry carried the same conviction. Poets praised not only their lover's eyes or hair, but also declared, "Her beauty proves her soul is pure." Beauty and morality became one, setting the standard men worshipped and women were expected to live up to. The ideal woman wasn't beautiful just for herself. Her beauty was interpreted as living proof of her virtue. But that belief brought heavy pressure. If beauty meant morality, then ugliness meant sin. Those unlucky in appearance became targets of scorn, exclusion, or even accusation. Society gave them no chance to prove themselves by action. They were judged at first glance. Beauty became both a reward and a chain, binding everyone to moral standards imposed by the community. And in this equation of beauty equals morality, medieval aesthetics revealed its deepest function. Beauty wasn't just about the body. It was a tool to preserve social and religious order. It was both weapon and standard, turning every face and figure into living evidence of the line between good and evil in the eyes of the community. Religion didn't just shape belief and spiritual life. It left a deep mark on every detail of clothing and dress. Clothes, accessories, colours, even the way fabrics were combined were controlled by rules rooted in the church. where beauty and morality were bound tightly together. Fashion was never just a personal choice. It was proof of obedience, and sometimes a tool to display status within the framework religion allowed. As early as the 12th century, many church decrees were issued to limit extravagance. Clergy preached that dressing too lavishly was a sign of pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. A woman in a gown with many layers, a deep neckline, embroidered in gold thread, might win admiration from the crowd. But in the church's eyes, she was spreading temptation and endangering her soul. That's why major ceremonies often came with strict rules. Women had to cover their shoulders, hide their chests, and wear veils to show humility. Men weren't exempt either. Knights and noblemen loved tight-fitting clothes that showed off their muscles, but the church saw that as useless vanity. In some regions, laws even banned overly tight trousers or tunics with slits cut too high, branding them as indecent. Religion demanded that men appear in banquets or churches wearing long, formal robes, a display of dignity. Colours were also regulated. Purple and crimson symbols of power and wealth were often reserved only for kings and high clergy. Women of lower rank wearing them could be punished for overstepping their place. On the other hand, black, dark brown, or grey were encouraged, as they were tied to humility. Clergy in particular warned that bright colours distracted people from serving God. One especially striking detail was the veil and head covering. In many teachings, women's hair was considered a dangerous instrument of seduction, so women entering church had to cover their hair, not let too much show. The veil became a symbol of modesty, and the more a woman concealed herself, the higher her moral standing. That's why golden hair seen as beautiful was only suitable in private spaces or in religious paintings of the Virgin Mary. Beyond ceremonies, daily life was also shaped by these rules. Many towns issued sumptuary laws under the church's backing, spelling out exactly which fabrics, jewellery, or styles each class could wear. Commoners weren't allowed silk or velvet, only nobles could. The goal was to maintain social order, preventing the lower from dressing like the upper. But at the same time, it reinforced the church's grip over personal expression. This control extended to jewellery and accessories too. Wearing too much gold and gemstones was condemned as a sign of greed. The church often preached that jewellery should be used sparingly, only to highlight virtue, not to flaunt wealth. Many sermons warned that women covered in pearls and diamonds would face God's harsh judgment for using beauty to stir desire instead of honouring humility. Interestingly, this religious control didn't just stop at rigid rules, it seeped into art and literature. In religious paintings, the Virgin Mary always appeared in simple garments, blue or white, symbolising purity. Female saints too were shown in modest dresses, to highlight that their beauty came not from clothing, but from inner light. By contrast, villains or sinners were painted in colourful, elaborate outfits, tying luxury directly to sin. And yet, people were never quick to abandon their desire for display. Because of the restrictions, fashion became a tug-of-war between beauty and morality. Nobles still found ways to design elaborate clothes, using fabric cleverly to obey the rules while still flaunting status. They'd drape cloaks to cover, but underneath wore tight gowns. They'd veil their heads, but stitch intricate embroidery into the edges. It was their way of both submitting to the church and bending the rules to show rank. At court, this was most visible. Grand ceremonies were both religious events and displays of power. Kings and queens had to dress in a way that satisfied the church's demand for modesty, but also dazzled enough to affirm authority. Every gold thread, every velvet fold had to be balanced too much, risked pride, too little risked losing royal image. This strict control turned medieval fashion into a mirror of faith and power. Every gown, every colour, every stitch carried moral meaning imposed by the church. People didn't just dress to live, they dressed to prove obedience to religious order. And in that world, beauty was forced to bow within the limits of faith, becoming inseparable from morality and divine authority. When religion and society together imposed standards, the divide in beauty between men and women became crystal clear. Beauty wasn't just the natural difference between the sexes. It was an expression of the roles, responsibilities, and positions each gender was forced to carry within the social order. Women were shaped into images of fragility, modesty, and humility, while men were painted as symbols of strength, authority, and courage. Women, in the eyes of medieval society, had to embody beauty tied to purity and fertility. Pale, white skin, a high forehead, sparkling eyes, and a demure walk were non-negotiable signs. The body had to be slender enough to suggest weakness needing protection, yet full enough at the hips and chest to signal motherhood. Every smile, glance, even their fragrance was controlled, so as not to cross the line, so beauty became proof of virtue. Feminine beauty was locked inside a frame of morality, where a woman was never free to flaunt herself but had to remain shy, like a flower under glass. Men's beauty, on the other hand, was aimed at power and order. The ideal man had to be tall, broad-shouldered, with a strong chest and decisive bright eyes. A moderately sun-kissed complexion showed battle experience, while neat beards and shoulder-length curls confirmed masculinity. If women had to keep closed smiles to appear modest, men were encouraged to laugh loudly, speak firmly, and walk with authority. The image of a knight in shining armor, or a nobleman in a heraldic cloak, was the very embodiment of masculine beauty at the time. This contrast was carved deeper through clothing. Multi-layered gowns forced women to walk slowly, making them seem delicate, every movement tied to decorum. Men's tight tunics and broad belts, by contrast, emphasized a muscular frame, letting them stand proud in a hall. Feminine beauty hid itself in concealment, while masculine beauty lived in the display of strength. What's remarkable is that medieval society always saw male and female beauty as complementary. A powerful man needed a gentle woman at his side, so authority didn't turn to brutality. A virtuous woman needed a protective man, so fragility didn't turn into helplessness. That's why art and literature often portrayed them in pairs: the knight and the lady, the king and the beautiful queen. Each represented half the ideal, only together forming the full picture. But this divide created different burdens. Women lived under harsher restrictions, since their beauty was directly tied to morality and chastity. One misstep, a smile too wide, a gaze too bold could condemn them as immodest. Men had more freedom, but still had to maintain a strong body and honourable bearing. A frail, small nobleman struggled to earn respect, since appearance was not just about aesthetics but a symbol of the ability to protect the community. In love songs, this contrast was idealized. She was fragile, her eyes glistening, a faint smile under her veil, the object of the knight's praise and protection. He was tall, sharp-eyed, with a noble beard, the steady pillar she could trust. Both were defined by their own standards, but together they formed the perfect couple in society's eyes. In art, the message was even clearer. Paintings of the Virgin Mary and Child often placed Saint Joseph or protective knights nearby, underscoring that female purity required male strength around it. Conversely, heroic men rarely stood alone. They were often accompanied by the faint outline of a woman in the background, as motive, inspiration, or reward for victory. So, in the medieval mindset, male and female beauty didn't just reflect gender differences. They upheld the entire structure of society and religion. Female beauty reinforced order in family and personal morality. Male beauty confirmed strength and social order. Each had to obey the molds of their sex, because any break threatened the stability the whole society depended on. Looking at this opposition, it's clear that in the Middle Ages beauty was never allowed to exist as pure aesthetics. It was bra, always tied to morality, class, and social roles. Male and female beauty weren't two separate extremes, but two halves completing one another, holding up a world where every look, every smile, and every movement was bound by the strict standards of the age. When beauty had become the measure of morality, power, and status in medieval society, another obsession crept into every thought: how to keep that beauty forever. Beauty wasn't just a gift, it was precious capital, the key to marriage, status, and admiration. But beauty, with the passing of time, was always threatened by age, disease, and death. And so, the Middle Ages fostered a relentless desire to make beauty immortal, or at least to fight its fading for as long as possible. For women, the fear of losing pale skin and a slender figure was constant. They used lead powder, arsenic, and herbs to cover flaws, believing those layers could stop time. Secret recipes were passed around: masks of milk, honey, or animal blood, bathing in rosewater, rubbing the face with ice. Behind these seemingly simple rituals lay a much deeper fear that once skin darkened, hair thinned, and the body changed, their value in the eyes of society would vanish too. Men weren't free of this obsession either. A knight's strong body, thick hair, and noble beard were symbols of power. But years of war, plague, and heavy drinking quickly wore them down. Many noblemen turned to tonics, herbal wines, even the pseudo-science of healers to preserve their youth. They believed that as long as they could maintain a strong figure and a commanding face, their honor would remain intact. The obsession with immortality stretched beyond the body into spirit and reputation. Beautiful people wanted their names preserved in poetry and art, rather than lost to age. Many noble women paid painters to capture their youth in portraits, or became muses in ballads. They knew that if beauty couldn't last on their bodies, it could at least live, forever on canvas and in memory. The nobility often sought mystical ways to cling to youth. Legends say some women bathed their faces in fresh blood to renew their skin. Others burned amber and inhaled the smoke, believing its scent slowed aging. Some alchemists sold elixirs of life, brewed from precious metals and rare herbs, promising eternal youth. Their effects were never proven, but the faith remained, because the fear of losing beauty was so overwhelming. Religion, while condemning vanity, unintentionally fueled this obsession. Preachers taught that the body would decay, but a beautiful soul was eternal. Yet those very promises of eternity made people fear the body's beauty fading even more. They clung to it as long as possible, not just to enjoy life now, but to prove before God that they were worthy of eternal grace. This obsession showed in art too. In many paintings, men and women appeared eternally young, with no wrinkles, no marks of time. Religious and courtly art idealized them, creating the illusion that beauty never faded. Art became both proof of life's fragility and a way to trick the mind into believing beauty could be immortal. In real life, old age became a source of dread. An older woman unmarried was often seen as worthless because her beauty had faded. A frail nobleman, with thinning beard and weak body, was no longer the knightly figure he was past his time. Age meant losing beauty, and losing beauty meant losing your place in society. This fear drove extreme behavior. People willingly used poisons, endured pain, all to preserve pale skin or a slim waist. Records tell of women tightening corsets until they fainted, just to hold onto their figure a little longer. Men drank herbal liquors so strong they damaged the liver, but kept drinking, thinking it kept them young. Poetry echoed the obsession, both praising and lamenting it. Ballads spoke of beauty as a flower blooming in the morning and gone by night, of youth slipping away like the wind. Poets glorified beauty while warning it couldn't last. That tension, the longing for immortality, and the fear of fading gave medieval beauty its mix of brilliance and sorrow. In the end, the obsession with immortality became inseparable from the culture of aesthetics. Medieval people didn't just build standards of beauty, they lived in fear of losing them. They clung to herbs, powders, clothing, perfumes, and art as fragile shields against the march of time. Because in their minds, beauty wasn't just a form, it was the only ticket to love, to respect, and, in the illusion of many, a pathway to touch eternity. Power was always tied to bloodlines, land, and marriage, and beauty quickly became one of the most dangerous political tools of the medieval world. It wasn't just a personal advantage, it was a strategic asset for entire families. A delicate face, a graceful figure could change the outcome of an alliance, or spark conflicts that lasted for generations. Women, especially noble daughters, were often treated as pieces on the political chessboard. When fathers and brothers needed to secure alliances, their beauty became a bargaining chip. A lovely young lady could easily be married off to a prince, duke, or count to seal the bond between families. In many cases, appearance, not the dowry, was the deciding factor of a marriage's value. Envoys often described the princess's looks in detail, because a single compliment about beauty could raise the stakes of negotiation. It didn't stop at marriage. Beauty was also a soft weapon inside the court itself. Many concubines, queens, or royal mistresses used their beauty to influence national decisions. A single glance, a smile across the banquet table, could sway the king's trust and shift the balance of politics. That's why beautiful women were both admired and hated. They were seen as puppet masters behind the scenes, yet also as the keys to their family's rise in power. Men weren't exempt from this rule. A handsome prince with a noble bearing and well-groomed beard was seen as far more worthy of the throne than his less attractive brothers. To courtiers and commoners, a radiant appearance was proof of God's favour. And so, physical beauty became a way to solidify legitimacy, to make rulers seem chosen by divine will. The danger was that once beauty turned into a political weapon, it also became an excuse for suspicion and purges. Many queens or consorts were accused of manipulating kings with their looks, which led to brutal executions. Behind those charges were usually jealousy or rival power plays, but the official reason was always the same: too beautiful, too seductive, too dangerous. In international marriage treaties, a princess's beauty was treated like a diplomatic charm. When one kingdom wanted ties with another, sending a beautiful princess was seen as proof of goodwill and power. People believed a lovely queen could soften a king's temper or melt a foreign court's resistance. In those cases, beauty didn't belong to the woman herself. It stood as a symbol of her nation's wealth and might. Art and poetry captured this idea vividly. The image of a princess, beautiful as a fairy, was described as the gift of a kingdom offered to its allies. Beauty was elevated into a strategic value, ranked alongside gold or land. A woman in this role was no longer just herself. She embodied political interests, but that made beauty fragile. If a princess was rumoured to be unattractive, treaties could falter and alliances collapse. There are records of envoys returning with harsh words about a princess's looks, and entire political marriages being cancelled. Beauty, in this sense, became a commodity powerful enough to decide the fate of nations. Inside the palace, the political use of beauty was even more dangerous. A beautiful concubine could raise her family from obscurity to power, but also attract the hatred of rival factions eager to destroy her. Every smile, every appearance at court became a potential spark for intrigue, where beauty was both shield and target. Because of this, many families actively invested in their daughter's appearance. They hired tutors to teach posture, cosmetics, and music just to make sure she dazzled before kings and nobles. Beauty was sharpened into a weapon, ready to be unleashed in political games. In a society obsessed with appearances, this was a calculated yet highly effective strategy. On a broader level, turning beauty into a political tool showed how medieval society elevated aesthetics into a power source equal to military and economic strength. Personal beauty wasn't just for admiration, it was a means to collective ends. It could secure a throne, preserve peace, or ignite war. And once beauty was bound to politics, it no longer truly belonged to the person who carried it. Those blessed with extraordinary looks weren't free to choose their lives. They were tools in the hands of families, courts, or entire kingdoms. Beauty, instead of a gift, became a burden, an inescapable weight that dragged its bearer into schemes, ambitions, and often tragic destinies. On another level, fashion itself was a battlefield of symbols. A single colour, a single pattern, even the way a belt was tied could carry political meaning. Wearing garments marked with the colours or emblems of a rival house could be seen as an act of betrayal. On the other hand, donning the king's colours during a festival was a public pledge of loyalty. Clothes weren't just for covering the body or looking good, they were a secret language, where every detail could be a declaration or a challenge. Even monasteries and the church stepped onto this fashion battlefield. Monks wore brown or black robes to proclaim humility, a direct contrast to the extravagance of the nobility. But that very simplicity became its own kind of religious fashion, held up as a moral ideal. Meanwhile, nuns in plain white habits and veils became the counter-image to lavish noblewomen. In that way, fashion wasn't just a contest inside the courts. It was a clash between morality and vanity, between the earthly and the divine. All of this shows that medieval fashion was a battlefield where no one stood on the sidelines. Every gown, every ring, every embroidered stitch was a statement. The wearer was fighting to assert status, to outshine rivals, to carve their name into the memory of those in power. And just like on a real battlefield, fashion was full of traps. The victor could win glory, but the careless risked disgrace or even death if their display of wealth was tied to sin or betrayal. Looking back at the entire picture of beauty standards in medieval society, we realize this wasn't just about hair, skin, clothing, or fragrance. It was an entire system, where beauty was tightly bound to morality, religion, politics, and social structure. It wasn't simply a visual pleasure. It was a form of soft power that could raise someone to the highest peak or cast them into the abyss. Beauty in that era was both fragile and unforgiving. Women had to keep porcelain white skin, a high forehead, a closed-mouth smile, and a modest gait. Men had to maintain a strong physique, neatly kept hair and beard, and sharp, decisive eyes. These traits weren't just to please others. They were conditions for being recognized as part of the social order. Anyone who broke the mold too beautiful, too dazzling, or too different was immediately met with suspicion, judgment, or even punishment. In the church's eyes, beauty could never be separated from morality. A symmetrical face was seen as proof of a pure soul, while deformity or ugliness was read as a sign of sin. And so, medieval society built a harsh equation. Beauty equaled goodness. Ugliness equaled evil. This was a powerful form of control, forcing people not only to make up their faces, but also to make up their behavior and lifestyle to fit the mold. Alongside religion, politics weaponized beauty as well. The beauty of noble women could decide the fate of a marriage alliance, shaping diplomatic relations between kingdoms. Inside the court, beauty became fuel for intrigue and power struggles, where every glance, every gown carried life or death significance. Men too used appearance to bolster legitimacy, proving they were worthy of the throne. Beauty, in that sense, moved far beyond the individual. It became political capital, diplomatic weapon, and sometimes the spark for war. And if beauty was a weapon, then fashion was the battlefield. The court turned into a hidden arena, where nobles competed with fabrics, jewels, and designs. A gown embroidered with gold thread wasn't just luxury, it was a declaration of power. A single misplaced colour could be branded as treason. Sumptuary laws arose to prevent excess, but in doing so proved that fashion was no longer personal choice. It was a tool to uphold social order. Underlying all of this was the obsession with immortality. Medieval people knew beauty was fleeting, easily erased by time, yet they clung to it. They used toxic lead powders, herbs, jewels, perfumes, and even mystical practices to preserve youth. They immortalized beauty in portraits, celebrated it in poetry, hoping to make it eternal. But the harder they tried to cling to it, the clearer it became. Beauty was no easy gift, but a burden and a responsibility. What's striking is that this entire system of aesthetics wasn't only about appearances, it revealed human desires and fears. The desire to be loved, recognized, and elevated through beauty. The fear that losing one's looks meant losing value, status, even a place in society. Beauty was both hope and shackle, binding everyone from nobles to peasants. In this picture, medieval beauty standards appear both harsh and full of contradictions. Women's delicate beauty was praised, but punished if it shone too brightly. Men's proud looks were admired, but feared if they threatened power. People longed for eternal youth, but that obsession drove them to self-destruction. Everything spun in a paradox. Beauty was glorified, yet also controlled and suffocated. So in the end, what was beauty in medieval society? It wasn't self-expression. It was a tool to control, to reinforce order, to maintain power, to safeguard faith. Beauty didn't belong to the individual. It belonged to the community, to the family, to the church, to the kingdom itself. And because of that, it shone brightly, but left countless tragedies in its wake. If we listen closely, medieval beauty still whispers a lesson that echoes today. Every society, in every age, finds a way to define and control beauty by its own standards. And when beauty is turned into a tool, people don't just wear clothes, they wear invisible chains. Chains heavier than any suit of armor on the battlefield. So we've just gone together through a long journey from pale skin and high foreheads to the lavish gowns of the court to see that medieval beauty was never simple. It was a weapon, a chain, an illusion of immortality, and also a mirror reflecting power and morality. Before you turn off the lights and let sleep carry you away, I want to ask, do you think beauty today is still a tool of power like it was in the Middle Ages? And if you lived back then, do you think you could endure those harsh standards? Share your thoughts in the comments, because I really want to hear your answers. And as always, if you found this journey worth continuing, hit like and subscribe, of course, only if you truly want to. Now, let the whispers of history carry you into sleep. Wishing you a peaceful night.